the crisis of conservatism in Britain is ultimately about ideology and identity. They don't really know who they are anymore. Philosophically, electorally, ideologically, they are lost. They don't really know where they need to go next. They don't know who's voting for them. They don't know why people are voting for them. And they don't know why conservative parties in Europe or the Republicans in the US are doing so much better than them while they are completely flatlining.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me. Nick is away, anticipating the arrival of a bouncing baby boy. Please wish him congratulations in case the baby's already arrived. It's any day now. This week, we decided to continue with our theme of paying attention to what's going on across the pond. We had this super episode we put together at NatCon of Swela Braverman, James Orr, Carl Benjamin, and Connor Tomlinson. And luckily, our friend Matt Goodwin was in Washington, D.C., so we thought we'd tape with him as well and dig a little bit deeper into what's going on in these United Kingdom elections. We think it's an important synecdoche to understand American politics. If you remember in 2015, the Brexit election presaged the election where Donald Trump won. And so there's always lessons to learn by paying attention to our friends across the pond. I got to pepper Matt with a trillion questions about what exactly is going on. But to tell you a little bit about him, he's a professor of political science, a writer, pollster, and political advisor to corporations and other bodies. He is the author of multiple award-winning best-selling books, including Values, Voice, and Virtue, and National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. He was the author of the definitive book on Brexit, Why Britain Voted to Leave the European Union, and political book of the year, Revolt on the Right, which successfully forecast the rise of populism and Brexit in Britain. He runs the second largest Substack in the United Kingdom. It is just called Matt Goodwin. If you go to mattgoodwin.org, you should be able to find it. Highly encourage you guys to subscribe. It is a one-stop shop to understand British politics, and he is a brilliant man. We talked about what exactly is going on in the UK and, sort of the many paths forward, both on policy, on tactics, on sociology, on party, and on leadership for the British right in order to reform their country. It was a ton of fun. We'll go now to Matthew Goodwin. Matt, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to where they are today. You're one of the most prominent conservative voices, small c, not capital C, conservative voices in the United Kingdom. Tell us the story. How did you end up where you are?
Well, I'm a professor of political science. I did a PhD in politics. I grew up in the south of England, and I got really interested in what was happening in Europe, particularly the rise of anti-establishment parties. And then, of course, 2016 happened. We had the vote for Brexit. You guys had the vote for Trump. And then a lot of my research started focusing on that. And then increasingly over the years, I became, on a personal level, steadily exasperated with the direction of Britain in particular, and started to become a bit more involved in politics itself.
What does that actually look like for someone in academia? I have a few friends that are in British academia, and it seems even more cloistered, even more intolerant of dissident views than the United States does.
Yeah, so in the 1960s, for every one conservative academic in Britain's universities, you had 3 academics on the left. Today,
that's a great ratio.
That's a really great ratio. For today, for every one conservative academic, you have 10 academics on the left. So that's a bit more like America.
That's honestly better than we are in the United States. That's still pretty good. I guess it's, belies how liberal the Conservative Party of the UK is.
Well, absolutely. But I've also watched many of my friends be cancelled, harassed, chased off campus because of their non-conformist political views. People like Eric Kaufman, Noah Carl, Kathleen Stock, a gender-critical scholar, among other people. And I think it's become very obvious to everybody that the universities essentially have been captured, a bit like their counterparts in the US. And I've become quite involved in that. I helped design and pass the Higher Education Free Speech Act, which is the first piece of legislation in Europe that actually creates a legal requirement on universities to protect and promote free speech. And I was pretty central to passing that law.
So talk to me a little bit about the specific moment that you were getting engaged in politics. Was it around the Brexit referendum, or what were some of those inflection points that led to you choosing to get more involved?
The first was a reaction to the vote for Brexit, where essentially the elite class denigrated much of the rest of the country because they happened to vote for something that members of that elite class didn't really want. The second was mass immigration, which under conservative governments, which is why I describe myself as small c conservative, not capital C. I'm definitely not a Tory, although I would describe myself as a conservative. Mass immigration essentially doubled under the conservative governments between 2010 and 2024, which I think has been a disaster.
What's that statistic? Something like 80% of the foreign-born population has come in under Tories, or something crazy like that?
Yeah, but basically what happened is when the Conservatives came into office in 2010, we had net migration at 300,000 a year, meaning 300,000 more people are coming in than leaving. By the time the Conservatives left office in 2024, that had risen to nearly 700,000 a year. So over the last 3 years, we've had 4 million people come into the country.
In a country of 30 million.
Yeah. And so what is happening at the moment is Britain, the UK, is going through the biggest population explosion since the 1940s, when a lot of squaddies came back from World War II, and we had a post-war baby boom. Of course, that was among the British population. What we've got now is a population explosion because of mass immigration, which the Conservatives essentially enabled.
Yeah. So there was just a tectonic shift in British politics with this most recent election. I want to start a little bit further back. When Rishi Sunak announced that there would be a election, what did you think he was doing that for? And are you glad that he did?
I'm glad the current incarnation of the Conservative Party has been destroyed because it isn't conservative, and we'll come back to that later on. Rishi Sunak thought he was being clever by calling the election early. He was trying to outflank a party to his right, the Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, and he was trying to essentially say, okay, we're probably not going to get better economic news. The economy's in the tank. We've got low growth, high debt, not much productivity. Let's just go now and hope that we can convince the country. The country, of course, were not convinced, and they delivered one of the most historic and heaviest defeats to the Conservative Party in its entire history. It fell to 121 seats. That's the lowest number of seats in the history of the Conservative Party, which, remember, is one of the most successful political parties in the history of democracy. And we saw the biggest Labour majority victory really since Tony Blair in 1997. So essentially, it was a repudiation of the Conservative Party because the Labour government that we now have came in on the lowest share of the vote for any majority government since the 1880s. Okay, so this Labour government that you're reading about now doesn't actually have much of a mandate in terms of the wider British population. It came in on 33% of the vote. But what this election was a punishment election. People punished the Tories, and a lot of people punished the Tories in particular for doing the opposite of what they promised. They put legal migration on steroids, they lost control of the borders, and they didn't put the interests of the British people first.
So let's use a figure like Suella Braverman as a synecdoche for the broader phenomenon. She was Home Secretary, presided over the same migration increases, leaves that position, and has now kind of emerged as a critic of the consensus position in the Conservative Party, even though she's not defecting to reform.
She should be defecting to reform, but that's another story.
Well, so tell me about it. I mean, she seems like someone who, I've interviewed her. I know people are friendly with her. She seems sincere in her desire to reduce migration. Correct me if you think I'm wrong there, but what were the constraints in the British political system that prevented her from implementing that policy? It seems to be the story of right-wing parties across the West that voters elect them to do things, and then they come up with 50 excuses for why they can't. What are the specific excuses in the case of the British system, and do they pass muster?
Well, I think when it comes to the Conservative Party, Suella Braverman is really somebody who is is an outlier. She is sincere in the things that she says. She does genuinely want to push back against this liberal brand of conservatism, almost liberal progressive brand of conservatism that we have in Britain. She was unable to do so because mainly we have a Conservative parliamentary party that leans much further to the cultural left than its average voter. So the story for American listeners that you really just need to understand in terms of the Conservative dynamic is after Brexit, the Conservatives became a different party electorally. They hoovered up a lot of Brexit voters who are more working class, non-graduate, older voters, culturally conservative. They want immigration reduced. They want the borders to be strengthened. They want all the things the Conservative Party said it was going to give them. They were going to take back control. Actually, the Conservative Parliamentary Party never delivered on that because instinctively it is more liberal than those new voters that it picked up after the Brexit referendum. So we went through Boris Johnson, who was basically a Bohemian liberal, Liz Truss, who didn't really care about a lot of these issues, and my personal view is she was a bit out of her depth. Rishi Sunak, who of course never had a democratic mandate, he was appointed by conservative elites in order to deliver a more technocratic managerial project. And so the Conservatives essentially end up presiding over what is a new post-Brexit consensus in British politics, which I think a centre-left government could preside over, which is big state, big tax, big debt, big immigration, big on woke. And so there really isn't much difference between left and right anymore. Now, people like Suella Braverman, Nigel Farage, they're kind of standing to one side and saying, well, can somebody in the room please be conservative? Because these guys aren't, which brings me back to what I said at the outset, which is there is no way the current Conservative Party will ever let people like Suella Braverman take over the Conservative Party. It ain't going to happen. What they're going to do is they're going to basically stitch up this leadership election so that somebody from the liberal centre ends up leading the Conservative Party. Or maybe somebody like Kemi Badenoch, who essentially is being bankrolled and supported by sort of establishment conservatives. So the only outcome for Suella Braverman and people like that in my mind will be to leave and to contribute to reform, which is led by Nigel Farage, and which is being used to essentially pressure not just the Conservative Party, but all of the big parties in British politics to get back in touch with the millions of voters in our country who say, look, mass migration's a failure, radical Islamism is out of control, the borders are not being strengthened, and what on earth was the point of Brexit if we're not diverging more from the European Union? The only thing the big parties in British politics have ever understood is pressure from outside. Reform is that pressure.
So until Nigel Farage announced that he was actually going to stand for election himself, it seemed like reform was maybe do you think they would have even picked up one seat if Nigel hadn't announced?
Nigel is essentially the Reform Party.
Right. So until then, there was one path, Nigel calls it the most boring election ever. I think that would have been accurate. But he announced. I remember reading in your Substack at the time, you very much saw a range of possibilities for what victory could constitute. Everything from reform getting more of a percentage of the vote than the Conservative Party, all the way to, maybe call it the 25th percentile result, is something like what we actually got. How are you calibrating the set of predictions you made, and what do you think the bottlenecks and the limitations that emerged that prevented him from that more transformative change were?
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, Reform did remarkably well for a small party in a first past the post system. One of their insiders said to me during the general election campaign, look, we're in a plane flying at supersonic speed and we're building the plane as we're flying.
Yeah.
Right? That's what small party life is like. Anyone who's ever been involved in party politics knows that. They got 4 million votes. They got 5 seats. They got 100 second places. And most of those second places are in Labour seats. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Reform had no party organization. They had very little money. They had Nigel Farage, so they had charisma and media attention, but they didn't have much in the way of, sort of backroom money and manpower. What they pulled off, therefore, was in a short space of time was pretty remarkable. And they did that by basically eating into the Conservative vote. They took 25% of the Conservative Party's electorate. So all the people who voted for Boris Johnson in 2019, Farage and Reform took 1 in 4 of those. And they did that mainly by targeting their concerns over immigration. So what you now have is a party that basically has a 2-flank strategy. It's going to continue to hit the Conservatives in parts of the South, in parts of Eastern England, by saying, look, you presided over mass immigration. You're not even a Conservative Party anymore. You're kind of liberal Tory establishment brand. Imagine, Trump taking on Mitt Romney. It's a sort of similar dynamic. Yeah. But now they're opening up a second flank, bit like, Republicans in Midwest and Rust Belt. They're going after Labour. So, the day after the election, Farage comes out and he says, now we're turning our guns on Labour. So a lot of working class districts, pro-Brexit districts, areas where, voters are looking at the Labour Party and saying, actually, I don't really want, woke ideology, mass migration. I don't want weak borders, So Reform's got potential. They can, I think, go from, if they play their cards well, from 14% to somewhere just above 20% of the national vote, which is where they were in some of the national polling during the campaign when they temporarily leapfrogged ahead of the Conservatives. So what Farage is trying to do essentially is Canada 1993. He's trying to realign the system and gradually replace a liberal Conservative Party with a proper Conservative Party. I personally believe this competition is required to remind the Conservative Party about the nature of conservatism, because they've clearly forgotten what the conservative movement is really all about. There's no guarantee that they will be able to fend off Farage, because he is a better campaigner. He has charisma. He has an understanding of an electorate that is socially distinctive, geographically concentrated, all the things you need in the first past the post system. But he's going to have to get other people around him, which brings me to the limitations. He needs a better quality of campaigner around him. He needs more money. He needs to professionalize his populist revolt, basically. So if you look at the literature on how you build successful political parties, you go from a breakthrough phase into a kind of, let's call it a kind of maintenance and growth phase. He's gone through the breakthrough phase, but now he needs to really professionalize in order to make this durable and get it from 14% to 20 to 25%. And then the rest of the Conservative Party that's left, and all the people that are likely have lost their seats already, but all the people who remain within the Conservatives but are being sidelined, like Suella Braverman, they will need to make a decision. Okay, which of these two vehicles has the best prospect of reasserting conservative values and defending the nation? And this is what's going to play out over the current parliament between 2024 and 2029.
Tell us about this new pick for Reform's chairman and whether or not he is consonant with that strategy that you've laid out.
Well, I think it's a really good question. I mean, they've selected a Muslim businessman who, you know, is very, very affluent, is largely unknown to the Reform movement. There is some skepticism among some in the Reform Party about the extent to which their new chairman is immersed in Reform politics. People are always skeptical of newcomers. There is also a skepticism.
Sorry, how does that work? I mean, the Reform's a new party as well, right? Is this, I mean...
Reform is a new party, but I would say for American viewers, what you have to understand is Farage is somebody with a 30-year lineage, right? So, you know, essentially this revolt began with the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s and went through a succession of parties, the Anti-Federalist League, the Referendum Party, the UK Independence Party, the Vote for Brexit, the Brexit Party, which then campaigned to ensure Brexit happened, and now the Reform Party. So you need to view Reform as essentially merely the latest chapter in a much longer story, right, which has been about mobilizing genuine conservatives, Eurosceptics, and let's say immigration skeptics as well. And that's where, you know, this longer journey comes in. But the new chairman, I think on the one hand, there is, among the people I speak to who in and around Farage, I think on the one hand, there's optimism and hope that this is a beginning of some professionalization, getting serious business people in positions of influence and power. This guy has made a lot of money. He's a very successful businessman. On the other hand, there is clearly online, on social media, some skepticism about, you know, whether he has been on a sufficiently long enough political journey to warrant a position of this influence. And that debate will unfold over the next, you know, few months and years. It's an ongoing discussion.
So I guess the obvious question for someone like him is, you know, originating the conversation is less of what's good for Reform and maybe using what's good for himself as a unit of analysis. You know, if he did have ill intentions, why wouldn't someone like that just join the Conservative Party and rise up through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Reform now do need to... Look, there are two things that they need to do if they're going to become a serious political revolt. The first is they need to widen their coalition. It can't just be the Nigel Farage show. Mm-hmm. It just can't be, right, if they're serious.
Who of the other MPs that were elected do you think has the most potential to become a nationally renowned figure?
Well, I think some of them in British politics already are. People like Richard Tice, you know, is increasingly a household name. Lee Anderson, increasingly a household name. But I think there's a generational element to this as well. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of Gen Z, you know, Zoomers, millennials who are out there on YouTube, Substack, doing alternative media, who are very determined and enthusiastic and keen to try and turn our country around. They are not currently getting involved or being pulled into politics to the degree that they should be. And Nigel Farage said something very interesting when he launched the Reform Party election campaign. He said, I acknowledge I can't just be the only person doing this anymore. I'm going to have to think about passing the baton down, and I'm going to have to start bringing other people in. Mm. Now, if he's serious about that, that's a really exciting opportunity for the Reform Party, because there are lots of prominent small C conservative people out there public intellectuals, thinkers, YouTubers, Substackers who want to get involved. But if it remains the Nigel Farage show, very narrow, limited kind of party that probably taps out at maximum 18-19% of the vote, then they're not going to reach their full potential. If you look at everything, I spend a lot of my time in Europe. If you look at the really successful populist movements, if you look at, say, Le Pen's National Rally in France, which is getting 35% of the vote, if you look at Meloni's party, which is running the government, running Italy, if you look at, say, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, you look at Sweden Democrats, they've all basically gone on this journey of professionalization, right? They've expanded their coalition and they've brought in Gen Z and millennials. The Reform Party haven't done that yet. You can see it in the demographics. They're still mainly a party of the over 60s. They're going to need to replenish their electorate. And so too are the Conservatives, by the way. Only 8% of Zoomers voted Conservative at this election. They're going to need to completely replenish their support if they're going to survive and endure and prosper over the longer term.
Talk to me about strategy here. So one of the things that seems frustrating to me as an outsider is that there's very little ability for reform to show momentum until the next election, which could be in 5 years. And so they've gotten these 5 or 6 people who are going to probably pretty ably, be a distinct center of gravity of opposition in parliament and be active on social media. But what's the playbook here for reform to actually continue that momentum and not just fizzle out in a few years when the Conservative Party will probably run on what's going to be a pretty disastrous labor record, pretend like that they fixed themselves and that they're serious, and voters generally have a short attention span. What exactly is the playbook there?
So I think for American viewers and listeners in particular, you need to remember that we no longer have European Parliament elections in the UK that used to be held every 5 years under a system of proportional representation. That is what made Nigel Farage those elections. It's easier to win those elections. When we voted for Brexit, we no longer had those elections. Okay, we don't have them anymore. So that basically leaves you with a number of possible avenues. One are local elections, which are held every year, which are kind of like your local municipal elections. Reform need to use those to put roots into local communities and to start to build a foundation for their movement. That's the first thing. The second are parliamentary by-elections. When seats become available, somebody dies or there's a scandal, they can then stand and compete and try and win another.
How often do those come around? Once a year?
Typically in the middle of a parliament, you'll get maybe one every few months.
Okay.
So that's another option. The third, doing things like, citizens petitions, campaigning, holding town hall rallies, going on tours, all that kind of stuff. And then four, social media. Now, if you look at the analysis of social media at the moment, Farage is basically killing it. He's the number one social media politician in the country. He's way ahead of anybody in the main parties. But they are going to have to...
That's UK traffic.
That's UK traffic, okay. Yeah. And, he's learned a lot, I think, from watching Trump, from watching the Republicans. Most of the people who run his social media are between the age of 22 and 30, right? They're like younger people with, a sort of savviness on that front. But I think, what your question is hinting at, and I agree with, is there needs to be a serious 5 to 10 year strategy about this realignment, right? Because if you're going to realign the right, it's going to have to be a long-term project. And then on top of that, I think there's going to have to be a philosophical or an ideological renewal. So, Reform just about got through this election by saying, okay, we're going to ban woke ideology. We're going to freeze immigration. We're going to leave the European Convention on Human Rights so we can control our borders. We're going to slash tax, slash regulation. And we're going to basically be a bit, fiscally conservative, but we're also going to be very strongly culturally conservative. And they just about kind of pulled that off. But they're going to have to go much further into the battlefield of ideas if they're going to present something that's going to be credible and competent and durable over the longer term. And I'm not quite sure that they're there yet in terms of the ideas in the manifesto. And the other thing, by the way, we're not mentioned too much, is much of this will hinge on the future direction of the Conservative Party, because, look, my working assumption is that the Conservatives are going to veer left. They're going to go for somebody like Tom Tugendhat. They're going to go for a kind of one nation liberal, which would leave Nigel Farage with an enormous amount of space in British politics. But of course, the alternative is they do veer right, and they go with somebody like a Priti Patel, or they go with somebody like a Kemi Badenoch, who at least sounds like she's on the right, if not necessarily in terms of delivery. And they try and shut Farage down by saying, okay, we're going to go even harder on issues like immigration, take on the woke, whatever. that is probably the most important variable that is going to be decided over the next 5 months, which is going to determine whether the Conservatives come off life support or whether they actually end up in a death spiral.
Talk to me a little bit about the ideological agenda underlying it. It seems to me that when a movement like this comes into shape in Western democracies, there's sort of two options. There's, take the existing political platform of the mainstream center-right party and say, no, we mean it. And so like more of that, or taking a kind of third way heterodox approach to politics. So we're going to take some good ideas from the left, some good ideas from the right and put that together. There's something in between. What is reform's ideological core going to be? What do you think it should be, beyond its oppositional politics vis-a-vis the current consensus on migration and woke?
Well, I think essentially if they're going to cut through in a bigger way, they need to take on the post-Brexit elite consensus in our country, which, as I said, is basically organized around a very big and expanding state, which is going to continue to expand under the current Labour government. We're seeing already a transfer of power to unelected, unaccountable quangos, or quasi.
Sorry, what's that word?
So they're basically quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations. Okay. So basically the deep state.
Yeah.
We're seeing a continued expansion of that. They need to be absolutely relentless at opposing mass migration and also the rise of a new sectarianism in our politics. We basically have a large number of Muslims in Britain who are now organizing politically along racial religious lines, particularly over issues like Gaza. We have 5 independent MPs elected at the election just gone in mainly Labour areas who are campaigning just on the issue of Gaza.
Do you think if October 7th hadn't happened that would have been the case?
No, but we know from surveys that about 40% of British Muslims would like to see a Muslim-only party, and we know that elsewhere in Europe, we are beginning to see similar kinds of mobilization. So I think, longer term, if you look at the projections of where European democracies are going, if you look at, say, the Pew Research Centre, we know that by 2050, Britain will be somewhere between 20 and 25% Muslim. Sweden will be 30 to 35%. This is inevitable in my view. So we need to think seriously about sectarianism. So reform, Nigel Farage was the only one talking about those issues. The British Tories won't talk about those issues because they view them as low status. They view them basically as, it's a bit cringy to talk about this. It's a bit difficult. It's complex. And, they want to be liked and they want to play the Westminster status game. Reform, to be successful, have to take on all of that. They also have to say, why on earth have we not created a more business-friendly, free market-oriented economy after Brexit? Why have we not slashed regulation for business? Why have we not slashed tax? Why have we not reduced corporation tax? Why are we now getting bombarded with new legislation around workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera? Why have we basically done the opposite of what Brexit should have been about?
But on that, in the United States, establishment politics on the right swims in the same direction as what you just said. It's all about tax cuts and lower regulation. Why is that not the case in the UK?
So British Tories talk a lot about reducing tax and creating a friendly environment for business. But if you look at what's happened over the last 14 years, they've actually done the opposite. So we now have the highest tax burden in our country since the 1950s. The state has remained very big, fat, overloaded and inefficient. The Conservatives have not really gone after that. And the one thing I would say about the American comparison is you might have people who talk a lot about that, but they're also, from my experience looking in from the outside, your Conservatives seem to understand the importance of the cultural dimension in politics at the same time. At least some of them do. Whereas in Britain, I think most British Conservatives view cultural politics and the cultural dimension of politics as low status, and they don't really want to get involved in it.
So on that, you mentioned the kind of game in Westminster. At my NatCon speech, I said, that in politics, sociology is a lot more operative than ideology in a lot of the case. Talk to me just about what's that environment like? If you're an MP in the UK, what are the cultural status and professional incentives that A, get you there? And then B, what are the incentives that keep you in line behaving a certain way once you arrive in Westminster? Set the scene for us.
Well, if you take your typical Conservative MP, they've probably gone through private school. They've probably gone through Oxbridge, Oxford or Cambridge. They've probably then gone into financial services. Maybe they've worked at Goldman. Maybe they've worked at a hedge fund. They've then, or maybe an internship in Westminster, and then they've become an MP by basically playing ball with the local branch, and then they've been selected to become a member of Parliament, and they are then in the sort of the subculture, if you like, of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which, as I say, leans more to the cultural left these days than their average voter. And once you're in that world, and it becomes all about essentially, social status and the preservation of status, you are instinctively suspicious of anything that is going to be seen to rock the boat. One of the reasons that Suella Braverman, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why people like, say, Suella Braverman is considered problematic by many Conservative MPs is because she has not gone along with the established consensus on these issues. She's willingly challenged that consensus, and that, of course, has had status repercussions. And also, to be frank, much of the media class in Westminster go along with the liberal consensus, and that's what it is. I mean, we have a socially liberal centre-left economic consensus that kind of dominates Westminster today, and if you step outside of that, you're considered to be inherently problematic. Nigel Farage is an example of that. Suella Braverman's an example of that. Some think tanks are examples of that, which means if you're making a low tax, small state, low regulation, low debt, low immigration argument, as lots of people have over the last 10 years unsuccessfully, you're considered to be outside of the Overton window.
One question that I'm always interested in politics is that principle and popularity are often related but not perfectly overlapping phenomena. What's those things that obviously would be the right thing to do for the future of Britain that the electorate is just not interested in right now?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things. I would say, for a start, we need to dramatically reduce the size of the state. I would say we need to reform
the NHS is a religion.
The National Health Service would be an example of that. I think it's an inefficient organisation. It is a religion. You're not allowed to criticise it, but if you looked at it as a business, I mean, it's just not returning on its investment at all. I think there are lots of things. We need to slash regulation for small businesses. We need to dramatically curtail our low-wage, low-skill migration policy. We need to leave European courts that prevent us from being a self-governing, independent, sovereign nation. We need to somehow find our way to a serious growth strategy to higher rates of productivity. We need to get closer to America, and we need to be more distant from the European Union. We need to think about where we're going to be over the next 30 to 50 years, not the next 5 years. There's lots of things that I think we need to root out woke ideology in schools, universities, and public institutions. We need to stop telling children that boys can become girls and girls can become boys. We need to implement the Cass Review, which recently concluded that our healthcare system was riddled with gender ideology, and it had no place in our healthcare system, but it's endemic in the schools and other institutions. We need to root that out. And I think the reason I say that is most voters, if they listen to what I was saying, they say, God, that sounds really radical. Because most Brits basically want to be seen to be nice. They want to be tolerant. They want to be civic.
It'd be like an entire country of American Midwesterners.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the civic culture that Verber and I talked about in the 50s. We want to be seen to be nice. But I don't think people understand the extent to which they're being subjected to a very radical political ideology. And I don't think they understand that. I think the ongoing response in Britain, if I talked about things like critical race or gender ideology, would be, if I said the word woke, they would say, woke equals being nice. It's just being nice. They don't understand the kind of system that is unfolding around them. So those are just a few of the things that I think we would need to change before I even get to the political class and the quality of leadership in our country. But I think start there.
What do most MPs do after they leave office?
Well, it depends how high up the poll they go. I mean, if they become prime ministers and chancellors of the exchequer, then they go and make lots of money on the speaking circuit, or they go back into the world of finance. And which, again, shows you a lot about the nature of our elite class. If you look at, say, Nick Clegg, Tony Blair, George Osborne, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, one of the sickening things about British politics is the extent to which people who are supposed to serve the country and who are supposed to reflect the values of the British people have basically left the country to go and make as much money as possible, while also in some cases working for some very unsavory characters who are undermining Britain, as in the case of Tony Blair. So I don't think it's been a great 20 years for the political class looking at how they've acted after government or after office.
You think Rishi's going to move to California?
Of course. I mean, if you believe the rumours in Westminster, his kids are already enrolled in schools in California. I'm not saying that's true, but I think, Rishi Sunak was emblematic of the broader problem. Okay, so here's the thing about Rishi Sunak that got me. Ex-financial services, very, very clever, but basically a technocrat, manager, at best a sort of business secretary, maybe, certainly not a prime minister. So you then spend months, if not years, bringing everyone around you down. Play a role in bringing down Boris Johnson. You play a role in bringing down Liz Truss. What was it all for? Right? To ban smoking, to cut a high-speed train line. I mean, there was no project. Sunakism never existed. There was no big, broad program. It was just like fiddling around the edges. And I think the reason I point to that is I think Sunak was symbolic of our political class. I think it's overly technocratic, managerial, no big vision, no big sense of where it wants to go, no big ideas. You go back to Thatcher as an example. Margaret Thatcher had serious people around her with serious ideas and a new theory or philosophy of inflation, the economy, and so on. There was a brains trust behind Thatcher. If you look at every Conservative leader since Thatcher, they've been surrounded by total lightweights who most people don't even know who they were working with. There was no big project at all. Cameron certainly didn't have one, not a serious one. Boris Johnson definitely didn't have one, and Theresa May didn't have one. There was no serious project. And, I think this is, again, the crisis of conservatism in Britain is ultimately about ideology and identity. They don't really know who they are anymore. Philosophically, electorally, ideologically, they are lost. They don't really know where they need to go next. They don't know who's voting for them. They don't know why people are voting for them. And they don't know why conservative parties in Europe or the Republicans in the US are doing so much better than them while they are completely flatlining. And that is an interesting thought experiment for American viewers. If you compare and contrast these two realignments, why is it that the Republicans are so much closer to theirs, are still maintaining theirs, still have a very credible chance at winning the 24 presidential election and taking control of the House, etc., while the British Tories have completely lost touch with their realignment? And I think that's ultimately a story about supply side. We have just as much demand in the UK for a conservative politics, but the supply to that demand, I think, has been woeful. It's been really inadequate. The Conservative MPs haven't understood it. They've not wanted to engage with it. If anything, they wanted to run away as far away from it as they can because it involves voters they don't really like. They don't really know. They're northerners and working class. They haven't gone to the right universities. And I think that really actually found its expression probably most visibly under Boris Johnson, where the Conservatives really did actually treat those voters with contempt.
Is when you talk about the supply side, I tend to be much more partisan of great man history than either party seems comfortable with in any country of note. In the United States, Donald Trump started that revolution, extended it through, and is still the central figure. Nigel made Brexit happen, stepped away for a few years, and is back. Is the alternative history one where he stayed and it was seen much more to completion? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think there was a strategic error on the part of Farage to stay at the front line of politics and hold Boris Johnson to account. I think had Nigel Farage done that, I think the last 5 years would have been very different. He could have played a bigger role in the COVID pandemic, and he could have played a bigger role in particular around migration. Now, to his credit, Farage was the only one talking about the small boats and the illegal migration that's coming across from France in the Channel. He was the only one talking about that issue from 2022, 2023. He was out there on the boats, if not earlier. But he wasn't playing a role in terms of frontline party politics. And, much of that goes down again to this assessment of what happened in 2019 when the Brexit Party, which was basically the Reform Party, said to Boris Johnson that we will stand down in all Conservative seats to allow you to win a majority, to ensure that Brexit gets done, because that was Farage's big legacy, and to also defeat Jeremy Corbyn, who was basically a hardcore socialist on the cusp of power. So it was a difficult situation for Farage to be in at that point. But I do think, had he maintained a stronger presence in, had they maybe not made that deal to the extent they did, because they feel that they've been betrayed by Boris Johnson and the Tories, had Farage stayed at the front line of politics, I think the election just gone would have not just seen 5 Reform MPs. I think potentially we would have seen a wholesale incursion into the Conservative Party. But that is, we'll never know. It's counterfactual history, right?
Walk me through what the potential paths here are. So obviously the one that it sounds like you'd be most in favor of is, over the next 5 to 10 years, Reform completely supplants the Conservative Party, and it is the center-right party in the UK. And
well, I don't know if I would be. I don't know if that would be my favorite.
Well, then lay out the paths here. There's people talk about a hybridized right-wing coalition. They talk about, well, what are the terms under which Nigel Farage and the Reform MPs could be brought into the Conservative Party? And then the one that I would
say that the preferred outcome for millions of people in Britain is that we have a realigned right of British politics that is much more in tune with the values and the voice of millions of people. That's the end outcome, right? How do you rebuild the right so it is connected to a durable, large coalition of voters? That's what we need to get to, I would say. And that means you need to somehow unify the Conservative Party brand and Reform. Many Conservative elites right now, 2024, are saying under no conditions should they ever do business with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, which is deluded given that this party has just taken 25% of your voters. You cannot ignore that party. You have to do business on some level with that party. There's no kind of outflanking Farage and Reform. You're going to have to come up with some accommodation. And I think I say that because the stakes are so high, because what we are also dealing with is an enormous Labour majority, the biggest since 97, and Labour are very clear as to what they're going to do. They're going to soften the borders even more. They're going to put mass migration on steroids. They're going to embed net zero and green politics. They're going to get us closer to the EU, which is a stagnant, failing, inefficient organisation, and further away from the United States. They're going to embed woke ideology into government departments, schools, universities. They're going to rewire the constitution to give votes to 16-year-olds. They're going to reform the House of Lords. They're going to give more powers to Scotland, Wales, weaken the union, and so on. And this is a really pivotal, important moment, which is why the stakes are so high. We can't afford to have 2 parties on the right. We can't afford really to have that in a first past the post system. If we do, then the result will be ongoing Labour governments. So we need to get as quickly as possible to a model of conservatism that understands where people are. And I'm arguing quite loudly in Britain through Substack and other things that the liberal brand of conservatism that triumphed between 2010 and really the Brexit vote in 2016, which was then misunderstood, that you can't go back to that. That's over. That's finished. You have to move forward. You have to build a new brand of conservatism that responds to the failures of the last 14 years. And that is going to have to involve people from Reform. There's going to have to be an accommodation because they're all in the same conservative family. Liberal British Tories who, went to Oxbridge might look down on Farage for class reasons, among other things, but they're still part of the same family. They're cousins, they're still, branches on the same tree. So they're going to have to come up with some sort of deal.
Talk to me a little bit about foreign policy. When I was in the UK, every time I'm in the UK, actually, it feels like, I have these great conversations with British conservatives that will, say all these things. And then you get to foreign policy and they're like, well, that's the one thing I really disagree with you American populists on. All of you Putin lovers, this, that, or the other. It's like clockwork every single time. Well, why is the British right so entrenched in foreign policy hawkery? I mean, I always joked that it's the memory of Winston Churchill. No British conservative politician is able to not see themselves as the next incarnation of Churchill. It's a form of brainworms that they'll, have till the end of time.
Yeah. Boris Johnson being the great example of that.
Yeah. I mean, his profile picture is still Ukraine.
Well, it's interesting that Boris Johnson came over to the US, met with Trump, and talked only about Ukraine.
Yeah,
and
so did David Cameron.
Didn't even talk about Britain.
Right. So what's going on there, and what would realignment on British conservative foreign policy look like?
Well, I think the liberal internationalists still basically dominate Westminster and SW1. I think there's not really been much of a massive rethink since the 2010s, and I think there needs to be. I'm very anxious about the new Labour government because instinctively it wants to rejoin the European Union. It might not say that out loud, but that's where it's going. It really does see its future much more within a kind of social democratic, kind of big state European Union. And it's going to be, it is very suspicious of the United States, and that will only increase if Donald Trump wins the election in November. So I think what you'll see is a growing push also, by the way, within government departments in the civil service, which are all dominated by Remainers, people who wanted to remain in the European Union. You will see that push become even harder. The Conservatives, there is a very strong Atlanticist wing that, have seen themselves, from notably Thatcher, have seen themselves closer to the US over the longer term. And Farage is part of that. I mean, he is really kind of pure Tory Atlanticist in that sense. He fundamentally views the UK's future as being closer to the US and Europe. And to some extent, Blair was like that as well, despite what he did later on in office. He was very close to the US. I would like to see us pivot more in that direction than towards the European Union. I would like us to learn more lessons from the last decade in terms of avoiding, completely pointless and chaotic foreign conflicts, and from Iraq to Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. I think much of the British political establishment really made a series of errors that have weakened, not strengthened our position in the world. And I'd like us to be a bit more realistic about our power in the world today. We are not what we were, but many people within the civil service still think, that we are this kind of, leading power that's capable of exerting enormous influence around the world. I think we need to be much more realistic about what we can achieve. And we need to be more nimble, independent, flexible, and make the most out of what we've actually been given through Brexit. We saw glimmers of that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, but I think personally, we've not really responded to that as well as we could have done.
For our members only section, I'm going to ask Matt about what he's paying attention to right now that no one else in British politics is. It's the standard question we ask where so many of our guests are Cassandras, and we're curious what they're thinking about that no one else is. In order to become a member, you can go to our YouTube channel and become either a truther or a statesman. Those are 2 levels. And you can get these episodes 24 hours early, as well as see these special members only segments. So Matt, this is our big question we always like to ask our guests is,
if you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out.
Matt, how can people keep up with everything you're doing?
Well, I've got the Substack, which is at mattgoodwin.org, and obviously I'm on X and so on. But the Substack is read by a lot of MPs, including 2 former prime ministers. So join us. We've got about 40,000 people on there now.
And will we ever see you running for office yourself?
I think the question is which political party will I be running for. I think that's a question, but you have to watch this space.
Well, exciting stuff. Thank you for joining the
Great.
podcast.
Thanks for making time for me while I'm in Washington. I really appreciate it.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed taping it. Matt is a breath of fresh air from a British political establishment that is constantly constipated and unwilling to say anything interesting. He certainly is. As always, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org to find everything that we have cooking as an organization. You can listen to the backlog of this show. You can find all the programs that we're currently soliciting applications for. Sign up for AM Fridays, our lecture series on Capitol Hill, and much, much more. Please reach out if you're looking to get involved in the next administration or working in Congress. In general, we are still here to serve primarily people who want to get involved in the fight here in Washington. You might see a ton of stuff that we're doing above the surface. All of that is just a funnel to get people involved here in DC. It's joy as ever to be working on all of that. An exciting season with Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance and more. Be sure to rate and review this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. 5 stars only, please. Send us an email if you have guest ideas. Be sure to become a member on YouTube as either a truther or a statesman. That gets you these episodes 24 hours early and also gives you access to special members only clips. And those are always a ton of fun. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. We will see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.